And it is now 10:30. Bill, I think we should go ahead and kick everything off.
Please go right ahead.
Alrighty. So everyone, here we go. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬、一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. Okay, Bill, time for me to mute my microphone.
Thank you much, and good morning to everybody, or afternoon or evening, whatever is appropriate for where you're located. It's a wonderful snowy day in Indianapolis again. We were really kind of hoping for an end to the winter weather. However, that has not been the case. We've had about a good coating of ice and a couple 3 inches of additional snow, and it's just as cold as it can possibly be outside again. But with the weather comes the promise of spring in a few weeks, so we all hunker down and make the best of it. If you live in an area where it doesn't snow right now, we're all quite envious, especially if the temperature is above 60. Today I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the concept of enduring happiness, of contentment. And there's actually a verse in the Tao Te Ching that speaks to this very thing that I found compellingly interesting while I was researching this talk. Interestingly enough, my kids and wife wanted me to talk today about faith and hope and the miraculous. And in a roundabout kind of a way, this chapter speaks to those very things in a somewhat indirect and obtuse manner. Chapter 46 of the Tao Te Ching starts out with, when the world has the Tao, fast horses are retired to till the soil. When the world lacks the Tao, war horses give birth on the battlefield. It further goes on to say that there is no greater crime than greed, no disaster greater than discontentment, no fault greater than avarice. Thus, the satisfaction of contentment is the lasting satisfaction. All we have to do these days to see the evidence and overwhelming truth of this chapter of the Tao Te Ching is flip on the television set, or take a peek out our door, or go to work most mornings, where we can find that we are surrounded by people who do not know contentment, who don't know what's enough or when to stop. Folks who are beset by the aberrancies of greed and discontent and avarice. They're all around. And I guess most of us at one point in time or another have been afflicted by those particular ailments. It was a big enough deal that Lao Tzu chose to write about it, and that's been thousands of years ago. And the human condition hasn't changed too terribly much since then. What he's really saying here, in Mr. Bill's paraphrased edition, is that when the people hold on to the Tao, when the people hang on to the Tao teachings, that equates to when the world has the Tao, when all of the people, or as many as possibly can, are holding on to the Tao teaching, then there's peace, and the people can concern themselves with the business of living. Their resources, their horses, their equipment, their fields, their land, their stuff is dedicated to peaceful pursuits, to in ancient times more agricultural pursuits than training for war. That conflict and derision are not prevalent in the land, and that the people are fairly content with their existence. The symbology of fast horses are retired to till the soil is that mental image of peaceful people living out their lives, doing what it is that they do, and being content doing it. And so being able to get on about the business of simply living. But it isn't just an existence of living. It's not just muddling through day to day, but it's pursuing a living that's rooted in contentment, a certain satisfaction with one's lot in life, with one's circumstances, with how things are going and where things are going, and how they're progressing along that path of living. And we all have those very same needs and those very same questions. I can't imagine that most of the people here listening to me are terribly different than I am. And every now and again, I kind of sit back and take stock of how things are going here, and how our lives are, and what can be made better, and what needs fixing, and whether or not I'm doing everything that I should be doing to create that atmosphere of contentment and happiness at home. Okay. And the flip side of the people holding on to the Tao teachings is when the Tao is ignored or abandoned, or when the world lacks the Tao. And in that set of circumstances, what we see is conflict, contention, strife amongst the people. The resources of society dedicated to the uses of force, the preparation for and conduct of warfare, instead of the business of living. And this condition of conflict and derision and restlessness and warfare continues for an indefinite period of time. Lao Tzu says that war horses are born on the battlefield. That means that the parents of these horses that are born on the battlefield were taken out there at some point in time, and they've been there long enough to have children. It's a long time. I don't know what the gestational period of a horse is, but it takes a while. Okay, so the whole point of that is that it's going on for an extended period of time, and the people are suffering, and contentment among the people is unknown. And I can't imagine that anyone in that situation would be content with a state of continual conflict and warfare going on around them, and yet it happens. In our modern society, we see the symptoms of this predominantly in our entertainment, our reality TV programming, most of which I don't even see the point of and refuse to watch. But even just the titles of some of these shows indicate the presence of this complete absence of contentment. When peace and harmonious relations are lost, then greed and avarice and discontentment are allowed to come into being. From a culture of conflict and derision, of strife, of warfare, of the absence of virtue and a peaceful way of doing things, we find ourselves locked into a struggle just to exist. We find covetousness for our neighbor's stuff, desires that we don't even necessarily need, but that we think we need, with thoughts and mental conditions and emotions that become more extreme, and actions that become more extreme. And hence Lao Tzu says that the greatest crime is greed, and the greatest disaster, discontentment, the greatest fault, avarice. These are the harbingers of a world of discontent. And there's a symbology in use there that it would do us well to pay attention to, because the world is all of us. Just as in ancient times the world was all of those folks who existed before us. And the people, the world, consists of the individuals in it. Lao Tzu was not just speaking in an allegorical sense. He was speaking to real honest to goodness people with real honest to goodness needs, wants, desires, families, and everything else that goes along with it. He was talking to the individuals who would one day read what he wrote. And it is the individual that is the progenitor of either that contentment or the conflict that springs from the lack of it. It is the individual person who will hold to the Tao teachings or choose not to. And to those who choose to hold on to the Tao teachings, those folks will know enduring and lasting happiness. Never thought so much had come out of a few short lines of text, huh? And isn't it that lasting happiness that all of us are really and truly searching for, right? The one thing that everybody says, I want to be happy. Well, within this few short lines of text are the keys to understanding contentment and happiness. Holding on to the Tao teachings is the source of that contentment and happiness. And please understand that this may not be the only path to achieve contentment and happiness, but it happens to be the one that we're talking about at the moment. I don't want to sound too horribly authoritarian in that regard, or have anyone think that this is to the exclusion of any and all other traditions, because it isn't. And in point of fact, it is possible for one to follow any number of traditions and arrive at the same place. So if your particular belief system or values aren't particularly Iguan Dao, that's okay. But still having that set of core beliefs and values that leads us down that virtuous path is the key to contentment and enduring happiness. And abandoning the Tao teachings, abandoning holding on to the virtuous way of living is what causes that discontentment. It is when we become bored with or discontented with or in conflict with our own current lives, perhaps our station in life, our position in life, our mate, our partner, our families, our stuff, whatever. Whenever we lose the happiness and joy that we once felt in those things, then we've found the root of greed and avarice and problems. Okay? Discontentment, that disillusionment with where we are and what we have, is the opening in the armor that allows the illusions of living and the extremes of emotion and action to come into being. And greed and avarice are two of the big ones that are sure to pop up. Greed's fairly easy to understand. Most people know what that means outright. It is wanting that which is not ours, and as much of it as we can get, to the exclusion of anyone else's well-being. Avarice is a little harder to wrap our heads around sometimes. Avarice isn't necessarily always an act, it's an attitude. Avarice is that thought process or group of thought processes that allows us to do unconscionable things and rationalize the suppositions that doing those things was right, or at least not as wrong as it could have been. I made mention of reality TV programming a couple of slides back. Avarice is at the root of the TV show Cheaters. I watch that show and it makes me uncomfortable from head to toe for so many reasons. First of all, because within that marital union, one partner or the other has gotten to a mental place where for whatever reason they're no longer content in their relationship, and they've both felt and found a way to go outside of that relationship to get what it is they think they need. And I find that deeply troubling. I find that deeply disturbing. And yet they've managed to make an entire TV show out of that one thing. That kind of discontentment is infectious. It's a cancer that eats away at the hearts and minds of people. It destroys the mind and the emotions. It ruins relationships. It causes pain that can carry on for generations. As families are broken up and the parents go through acrimonious and bitter legal conflicts to end what used to be happy ones, the pain goes on and on. And that is intrinsically an abandonment of the Tao teachings. It is a conscientious and willing ignorance of virtue and a complete and utter lack of control of one's base desires. Avarice is what allows us to steal the $20 bill off our co-worker's desk and rationalize that if he didn't want it stolen, he shouldn't have left it there. It's the rationalization that says if I don't get caught, what they don't know won't hurt them. But I'm going to tell you all what. I was not always a cultivator of the Tao teachings. And there have been times in my previous life where I was not always the person that I am today, and where I have said and done things that have caused other people tremendous pain that I now deeply regret, and where I could made amends for. But my point in saying that is that when we follow avarice down the path, we don't just hurt other people, we hurt ourselves as well. All of the rationalization in the world doesn't get rid of the guilt and the pain that one feels every time they look in the mirror, as they realize that what they've done has caused another person incredible grief and pain and torment. It doesn't cure the understanding that what we did was horribly wrong. And sometimes we do those things out of ignorance, and sometimes we do them out of choice. But however they get done, the end result is still the same. It breeds contention and conflict. It causes strife and derision amongst people. As it breaks up families, it can also break up towns and villages. Okay? It can spread almost pandemically, like the influenza does, to everyone around a person. And so it becomes the greatest disaster that Lao Tzu could think of. Greed and avarice cause people to do things they just wouldn't ordinarily ever do, under the rationalization that they've just got to have whatever it was they were chasing. Greed and avarice are an infectious disease of the human organism. They are the extreme outlets of unchecked and unvirtuous living. They are what happens when we allow our base desires and our extreme emotions to get a hold of us without reining in the extremes and the desires. One of the absolute miraculous occurrences of holding on to the Tao teachings is the ability to moderate those desires, the ability to supplant the emotional extremes to reasonable and much wiser, controlled thinking. And I can't begin to tell you, particularly since my previous manner of dealing with conflict wasn't very effective, how much that holding on to the Tao teachings has helped me. I've said before here with a degree of frequency that the way I used to deal with conflict was to kick the door in and come in with both guns blazing. And I won't say that in every occasion these days I manage to control that emotionalism. I have on occasion been known to absolutely use an awful lot of intensity to help somebody understand my point of view. In particular, when they diagnosed my son with Asperger's syndrome, his school system had tried to simply label him as learning disabled, which would have disqualified him from a number of benefits that he really needed to thrive and survive. And I became much more emotional there than I think I should have. I didn't yell or scream or hop up and down or break anything, but there was a high degree of intensity as I asked those folks who was going to sign off on the lie that my son was simply learning disabled. Those things can sneak up on us, and before we know it, we've got ourselves a problem. When a person becomes discontented, they become susceptible to greed and avarice and the excesses and extremes of emotions and actions. The extreme desires create the extreme situations, and then we find ourselves up to our necks in them, and we can't always get out. And the extreme situations that we find ourselves in nearly always create conflict and contention, and therefore war horses give birth on the battlefield. Those things don't simply go away. Learning not to succumb to those extremes is what returns the people to that peaceful, contented, going on about the business of living lifestyle that all of us seek. For as long as we remain in the extremes, we have no peace, no joy, no enduring happiness. And so Lao Tzu says at the end of chapter 46, thus the satisfaction of contentment is the lasting satisfaction. The unwritten sentence there, I firmly believe, is Lao Tzu saying, you know, if you understand contentment, if you understand when to stop, what's enough, right? When you hold to the virtues and the integrity you know to be right, then and only then can you really know enduring happiness. I believe that's the truth. Knowing when to stop is unbelievably important. When not to push the extra mile. When not to acquire the stuff we can't afford. Knowing how much stuff is enough and learning to unclutter not only the physical life, but the mental and spiritual life. Knowing contentment, being able to look at our situation in life and say, you know, it's not so bad. Yeah, I've made my mistakes. I've had my problems. I still have a few of them. But all in all, we're not starving. We're not broke. You know, we don't have a child afflicted with a horrible disease of some description. And so life isn't too terribly bad. And if we continue to move along the path of learning how to conduct a virtuous life, it gets better. I'm not going to branch off into a whole discussion about karma at the moment, but it's been my experience that the direction in which we move is the direction in which things tend to fall. And so if we are moving in a more virtuous and more thoughtful and more conscientious pattern of moderated behavior, things tend to work out to allow us to continue to do those things. If we are moving towards a more extreme, less controlled, less virtuous way of doing things, then things will tend to unfold to permit us to continue to do that as well. It's important to remember that the Tao of Heaven is not a respecter of persons, nor is it an arbiter of the law. It simply is. We have to choose which way we're going to go. We have to choose when to stop. We have to choose what's enough for us. We have to choose to realize that our lot in life is our lot in life and be content with it or not. And if we are not, to change it in a positive fashion. Sometimes we have to choose minute by minute to exercise the virtues, as opposed to allowing the illusions of power and control to drive us to the things we know we should not do. But the Tao teachings surrounding knowing when to stop and what is enough and understanding contentment and virtue are the teachings that nurture happiness and peacefulness. They grow contentment in our lives. So that by holding on to those teachings, we get to the point where we can look out the door and say, you know, life is good. I've been able to say that now for several years, a long time, as opposed to continually striving for what I didn't need or didn't really want. And it's astounding how much stuff we look at that we think, gee, if I only had that, I'd be really happy. That when we acquire it and we find out we're not really happy, we don't understand why. And out in front of us is one more thing that if we just had that, you know, we'd be really happy. That cycle of discontent and acquisition can go on forever. Okay, the guy that dies with the most toys doesn't necessarily win. But the guy who dies with the most toys may have the biggest ulcer. And I think I'll skip that part. The Tao teachings teach us differently. All we have to do is choose to follow them. When Lao Tzu penned those words, I believe that the mental image he drew in the minds of his readers was remarkably graphic and incredibly meaningful. In ancient times, one did not hop in the old Chevy or Honda or whatever and drive down to the supermarket to pick up a gallon of milk or some, corn on the cob or whatever. One went out to the fields and grew what they wanted to eat and got their milk, eggs, and butter from chickens and goats and cows or whatever was wandering around the farm. That was a worldwide phenomenon for an awful lot of years. It's been within the last, 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years or so. Yes, I'm an incredible history buff. that we have had enough mechanization, particularly here in the West, to create the super grocery store phenomena. For most of the existence of mankind on this planet, that phenomena never existed. And so talking about your horses being retired to the field to till the soil for you, that really brought home a message. As did war horses being born on a battlefield where one could not grow a crop for anything simply because it was trampled under the feet of soldiers and animals that were bred for war. That symbology, at least for me, is as graphic now as it probably was then. I can draw that mental picture in my mind. I can see in my mind how those scenes must have looked. And although I probably couldn't grow a crop of wheat or rice at gunpoint, the mental image of that green and fertile field blossoming in the spring, very much like the background on my laptop, is a mental image that I hold dear. It's the picture of spring, and every time I see a spring, I thank everything that I hold holy I was allowed to live to see another one. So the symbology is fairly easy to get a grip on. Knowing contentment, on the other hand, maybe not so much. But knowing contentment's absolutely crucial in achieving any kind of enduring happiness. Without it, a person can spend an entire lifetime in conflict and strife, always looking everywhere except in their own heart for that which they believe they need. That's no way to live. And it entails an awful lot of pain to continue to try. Greed and avarice and discontentment destroy the lives of people and infect the people around those whose lives it destroys. They're not pleasantries, they're not survival needs, they're not even worthwhile pursuits in a lot of cases, and yet they are insidiously soft and so easy to become trapped in that very often by the time we realize we got a problem, the problem is enormous. But it's not a problem that can't be fixed. And finally, holding on to the Tao principles, at least for me and hopefully for most of all of the rest of you, is a sure way to avoid those catastrophes. And while the words greed and avarice and discontentment in and of themselves do not necessarily spell catastrophe, their effect on the lives of people and those who are touched by them absolutely does. So if I could say anything to kind of tie that all up, take a look out the window and understand that no matter how desperate life appears, how tough it may look, how bad or how bleak one may think it is, it could always be worse, and oftentimes a lot worse. And perhaps being content for being where we are and starting from there might be a good way to start to look up. It is indeed a miraculous and wonderful thing that the Tao teachings can transform a person from the inside out. I absolutely know that. I've seen it work in me. To give it an opportunity to do that for yourselves as well is a wonderful and very worthwhile thing to do. Thanks so much for letting me share with you, and have a wonderful week.